Hello and welcome to our discussion on Moldova. I'm Jill Dougherty. I'm a global fellow at the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute and also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. You know, the events over the past 2 years in Moldova have been truly breathtaking and complex. So here's a little history to begin. From 2013 to about 2019, Moldova was what's called a captive state, controlled by a corrupt oligarch who was a member of parliament. But about 2 years ago, another member of parliament, the young Harvard-educated economist Maia Sandu, joined forces with Moldova's Moscow-friendly president, Igor Dodon, to push out that oligarch. And then, in November of last year, she ran against Igor Dodon for the presidency, and she won. But that wasn't the end of the story. She dissolved parliament, called new elections, and in mid-July of this year, Sandu's party won a landslide victory over its pro-Russian rival. But this isn't your usual East versus West story. There's something maybe more significant at play. And to help us understand this, we have two experts who know Moldova very well. The first one is William Hill, Bill Hill, as we know him. He's a global fellow at the Kennan Institute here at the Wilson Center. He's also a distinguished retired foreign service officer and truly an expert on Russia and the former Soviet Union. He served 2 terms as head of the OSCE mission to Moldova, where he was in charge of negotiation of a political settlement to the Transnistrian conflict, and he facilitated the withdrawal of Russian forces, arms, and ammunition from Moldova. He's also written a book about that. And our second guest is David Smith. He's an entrepreneur. In fact, he's a restaurateur. We'll get some details on that, but he is president of the Moldova Small Enterprise Alliance, and that's an association of small businesses advocating against corruption and for economic reform in Moldova. He's a former Peace Corps volunteer. He's lived in Moldova since 2012, so he knows the place well. And he currently writes Moldova Matters. That's an English language newsletter with a weekly roundup of top political and economic news in Moldova. So, got a lot to cover here. And Bill, I'm going to ask you to kick it off. If this is not the traditional East versus West scenario in Moldova, what exactly is it?
Thanks, Jill, and thanks to Kennan for arranging this conversation. It's good to be part of it. We're seeing in Moldova, I think, some real political change, not just the election of a reform party, the Party of Action and Solidarity, which for only the second time in Moldovan history took over 50% of the total popular vote. But we may be seeing the kind of political change that comes once in a generation, a tectonic change in voting patterns and parties. Since the fall of the Soviet Union and into the late 1990s, Moldova's been dominated by a political pattern where there have been basically 2 overall political forces. People have put it in geopolitical terms. Pro-East or pro-Russia versus pro-West, pro-Europe or pro-Romanian. But it's really much more. The population has been split upon cultural, ethnic, national, linguistic lines, where there's generally been about a half of the population that speaks Russian or is oriented towards Russian culture and the Russian Soviet heritage, and tended to vote for left, center, or left parties, the communists, and followed by them the socialists, and a pro-Romanian, pro-European, pro-Western half of the country that tended to vote for right or right-center parties, which until recently have generally been splintered. There have been a number of them. And this pattern over the past 20 years, during roughly oversimplifying the first decade of this century, Moldova was dominated by the communists, the pro-left, pro-Russian party. In 2009, a pro-Western coalition came in and ruled for some 5 years or more. The problem is that both left and right coalitions have been both corrupt, inefficient, and incompetent, and have really alienated the population. So that by 2020, the presidential election, and 2021, the parliamentary election, you see evidence of real change in the voting patterns. Since the late 1990s, almost 1 million Moldovans have gone abroad to work, to emigrate, sending funds back. At first, these folks were not involved in Moldova, but in the last 2 elections, the diaspora has voted in unprecedentedly large numbers. And in the voting this time also, there are signs that voters who in the past would have voted with the left of center, Eastern-oriented parties have come around and have voted for Maia Sandu and PAS, which may explain why PAS in the last election got over 50% of the popular vote and 63 seats out of 101 in parliament. A lot of this focus is not on geopolitics, which have been used as an explanation and as electoral tactics, voting pro-Russian or pro-European, but the increasing discontent of the population with all of the political parties and many of the leading politicians, and the deep corruption, the domestic stagnation, and the inability of Moldovans to provide for themselves and family with good jobs at home, and therefore having to emigrate, eventually, I think, just reached a breaking point, as especially younger Moldovans saw no future in Moldova with the current political elite, and determined to throw them both out. And it looks like this may well be what happened. A lot will depend on the performance of the new ruling party of PAS, but it appears that there's an opportunity for real lasting political change. The other factor that I wonder about, we can't prove now, but it may be one of the things, one of the straws that broke the camel's back may have been the pandemic. Just as in America, a lot of the Republican campaign officials blame the pandemic for Donald Trump's loss and say that he probably would have been reelected had it not been for the effects of the pandemic. The government performance during the pandemic in Moldova has been just absolutely woeful. And I just wonder, I think this is a part of pushing a number of Moldovan voters over the line towards a new political solution and a new political pattern in Moldova. In any case, what you can look for in the future, Maia Sandu and PAS has promised real focus on domestic affairs, on anti-corruption. President Sandu's focus in particular in recent statements has been reform of the judiciary to eliminate corrupt judges, corrupt officials, and put the government and society and the economy on a more open, more honest basis, allowing for foreign investment and building of the Moldovan economy. And this is what the new government, you can expect to see the new government focus on, less than geopolitics. I mean, geopolitics will play a role. Russia and the West have competed for at least 2 or 3 decades in Moldova, and that won't go away. The bulk of the population, as before, is oriented largely towards Europe, towards EU membership, but does not wish hostile relations with Russia. A lot of Moldovans still work in Russia. Moldova does a lot of trade with Russia. And one key factor will be how well President Sandu is able to manage the relationship with Russia. She started out trying to have a positive, constructive, pragmatic relationship with Russia. We'll see whether Moscow allows this. But I think overall, there is a real opportunity for fundamental political change in Moldova, which could bring real economic change, an end to economic stagnation, and a real change in a small but key part of this part of Southeastern Europe. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to hearing what David says about events in Moldova on the ground.
Yes, and in fact, David, you're the perfect person because you know Moldova up close and personal, and very intrigued to talk with you about, and Bill mentioned this over and over again, that issue of corruption. When I was reading about this, I was stunned to see just one part of it, which was that statistic about 12% of the country's GDP was embezzled. And Bill was telling me before we started, it's even broader than that. So I guess my question to you, David, is could you describe, and you've been in that part of the world for quite a long time, how monumental is the level of corruption, and why now is this push for change coming? Who's it exactly coming from?
Yeah, thank you, Jill. And thanks for the Kennan Center setting this up. Very excited to talk about this today because it really is an important time in Moldova, and a really interesting sea change is going on politically here. So if we talk about corruption, many people say, is endemic in Moldova. It really exists at almost every level of life, from getting your kid to go to a kindergarten, to paying a teacher for a grade, to opening a business, to then maintaining that business or defending that business in many types. And there's a misperception often that this is a type of corruption where people, they want to get an A, they're not a good student, so they pay the teacher. But more often what you have is really a system of extortion, where you have people who are simply will not let you pass school. They will not let you open a business. They will not let you frankly, see a doctor in some cases without these facilitation payments and bribes. But this is kind of our petty corruption. As a business owner, I've experienced quite a lot of that over time here. And I think almost every business owner, in addition to pretty much anybody who lives in Moldova, experiences it frequently throughout their life. But at a high level, we also have this much bigger phenomenon of corruption in a sense. So you have your petty corruption and the big corruption, the huge bank theft and the theft of the billion here, facilitated by a group of oligarchic businessmen led by Ilan Shor and Mr. Plakhatnuk and some others. And this huge theft really started to destabilize the political system as well as the economy. And what I'd say, building a little bit on what Dr. Hill said and looking at the shift from kind of this pro-European coalition that turned out to be very corrupt after 2009, but did take the country in one direction a little, and then the Moscow coalition goes a little back. At a different level, what we're seeing is kind of a struggle between oligarchs hoping to capture the state for themselves and a type of oligarchic pluralism that existed between multiple parties and groups. So when the pro-European coalition came to power in 2009, many business people found that time to be incredibly distressing. When before that, the communists under Mr. Voronin were there, you had one person you needed to bribe, one party, one group. But now you suddenly have 3 or 4. And they all felt like they could come take a piece of you because you had these different factions within government and society, and the ministries were split up differently. And then Plakhatnuk came to power, and he reconsolidated that. And once that broke off back in 2019, there are already conversations amongst business people thinking, oh God, we don't want to go back to this place where we've got so many different groups and so much uncertainty. But I think, well, that's a rational, I suppose, way to look at this evolution and this fighting between oligarchs. What really happened at a bigger level was society kind of said, we're not buying these arguments anymore. Every time something huge is stolen, they come out and say, well, we speak Russian, so side with us, or we speak Romanian, we side with us, or this is a pro-EU party, so yeah, we might steal a little bit, but we basically have your best interest at heart. And a lot of these issues have simply been distractions, and they've been used very, very effectively by these different oligarchic groups and parties to split and fracture society. And so we've had these very unstable coalition governments year after year after year, which promise to do something about corruption, but in fact, they've facilitated it. They've grown it, they've benefited from it in many cases. And this is not to say everybody. There are many good politicians and civil servants in Moldova too, but it was deeply embedded in the system. And I think what this election showed was it came out as really a wholesale rejection of kleptocracy as a kind of governing idea. It's not okay to have somebody who does something good on one hand, but also steals a lot on the other. Well, Mr. Shore facilitated the theft of $1 billion, and he used a lot of it to get elected mayor and build an amusement park. And as he ran for election, he said, I'm going to build amusement parks like this in every town. And that simply didn't hold water this time. One other thing I'd mention here is, I think what we've seen from this election is politics changed. Traditionally, political messaging in elections meant leaders would go on TV a lot. Different oligarchs would control their own TV stations. They would kind of message their faces into the living rooms a lot. And then a campaign would involve people going around the country, speaking to a group of people in an auditorium, and this type of thing. It was quite geographically focused, like, oh, we're interested in these Russian speakers here, we'll go do that. What the PAS party managed to do here was create a real grassroots campaign. You had volunteers all around the country, knocking on doors, talking to people. In some regions that, like Orhe, which is the stronghold of Mr. Shore, they knocked on almost every door in the entire rayon, which is like a county, 3 times. They talked to everybody. They met with people, and they didn't just come and say, vote for us. They had this very positive message. Their message and campaign slogan was, let the good times begin. And it was, we propose good times for farmers. Here are our farm and agriculture policies. Good time for families. Here are our student and education policies. Good time for entrepreneurs. Here's our reforms. And the underlying message for all of it was, corruption is what's getting in the way of us having these European things. It's not about an EU flag. It's not about being a member of a club. It's a matter of having better roads, not perfect roads, not German autobahns, but better roads. By having better public services, by having public servants who act like public servants, not, frankly, little tyrants who want to extract a bribe from you all the time. And this was a different way of doing a campaign here, something I have not seen in my time in Moldova, and talking to everybody I've spoken with here, they say, no, this was truly unusual. This was a kind of a people's movement united around this idea of fixing the problems at home in Moldova. So it wasn't, we're going to join the EU and they will solve our problems, but it was, we need to get our house in order, frankly. And a lot of young people went out and did the volunteering work and did the footwork to make that happen. So I think it's a pretty extraordinary election and campaign we saw, a very big reorganization of the way politics has been done. And I think it means we have to kind of look at Moldova differently. We have to take away the post-Soviet lens, stop using the word post-Soviet too much, and look at the fact that this is a country struggling really hard to break away from a endemic and kleptocratic and corrupt system and build a rule of law-based future. So I find it intriguing. There are many challenges ahead. Even with a large majority in parliament, it's going to be very difficult to reorganize a bureaucracy that is designed right now to work for some few special interests in many cases. But it is going to be more possible, or let's say there's a bigger opportunity for real change than we've ever seen. We have a majority in parliament with PAS, Maia Sandu as president, a political mandate, and quite a lot of willpower to take action. So it will be interesting to watch. I'll leave it there for now.
It's really fascinating what you're talking about. I think in other parts of, and I agree with you, I hate to use that phrase, the former Soviet Union, because it really is antiquated. It doesn't capture, I think, what's going on in that region, but let's just call it the region. You are seeing more people, maybe because they're educated, maybe because they're, they're entrepreneurs or doing something, but they're taking action into their own hands. And it's not theoretical, it's not philosophical, it's very practical. But I do have to go back to Bill, because there are some big picture issues here. And one of them, I think, is the role of Russia. And Bill, if I am correct, from what I read and know, Russia took kind of a different approach, a more hands-off approach. And I'm intrigued if you could drill down a little bit to explain exactly how Moscow looked at this and why they didn't interfere as perhaps actively as they could.
Well, first of all, a number of commentators have said, oh, well, Russia didn't do anything or didn't. I'm not sure that's, I would put it rather that I'm not sure that Russia knew what to do. I mean, Russia had supported Dodon fairly strongly. As recently as 2019, one of Vladimir Putin's most trusted right-hand men, Dmitry Kozak, had been set up. He's, I think back to deputy head of the presidential administration in Russia. He'd been a deputy premier too, but he's done all of the tough jobs for Putin. He was given Moldova, not just Transnistria, but Moldova, their relations with Moldova, an economic commission. And they've had Dodon up there frequently. They've given him lots of money. If you look at the campaign and the complaints of some of the opponents of the socialists in the campaign, they're complaining about all the things that Russia is giving Dodon. The problem is that the Russians clearly, and I've heard this informally from them, from some, as well as you can see it reflected in the Russian press, is their clients are not really competent. Their clients did a bad job. They did not have a good leadership. The difference was that Vladimir Voronin, whether you like him or hate him, was a good politician who built a party himself in the 1990s, won in Moldova, and then turned to Russia for help rather than getting help from Russia to be foisted upon Moldova. And by the late teens in Moldova, the socialists, just Dodon promised all sorts of things, was in Moscow constantly, but he couldn't deliver for the Russians. And the Russians, I think, would like influence in Moldova, although they are increasingly, I think, resigned to the fact that Moldova is further away and they've got troubles in all sorts of other parts of the former Soviet Union. And they will, they will deal with President Sandu. They may make trouble. There are some in Moscow that are still talking about this or what they don't like about the elections and the incoming government. But they basically have had a great shot with an overtly pro-Russian president and some pro-Russian parties and a neutral caretaker technocratic government that was really as much pro-Moscow as pro-Brussels, and it didn't get them anywhere. So what are they going to do? That I think is more the problem from Moscow's angle. And lastly, in between Moldova and Moscow, they've got Ukraine, which is a much bigger problem for Moscow and a much more serious potential loss of influence in their neighborhood, which is going to take much more of their attention, I believe.
David, Bill alluded to this, but in the region, you've had revolutions over the past, decade and more, Ukraine, Georgia, et cetera. And many times after these political changes, the new leaders say, this is going to change, we're going to end corruption, et cetera, et cetera. So what are the realistic chances of this really happening in Moldova?
That is the million-dollar question. I think I remember seeing a quote from Ukrainian President Zelensky shortly after his party won parliament, which said, basically, we have 6 months to get this stuff done. Because after 6 months, we are going to risk our coalition fractioning. We're going to risk parliamentarians being bought. This is a serious problem in Moldova, where an oligarch or corrupt leader or Russia will just literally buy off a parliamentarian. And the press has reported the price list in the past. They can go from around 50,000 euros to well up in the six figures, what somebody will cost to switch parties and switch sides. So these are really big challenges. But I think when we look at across the region, we should say that there is something different here. And I think it goes really well, back to what Dr. Hill was saying about the Russian involvement here. I think it would be fair to say that there was a lot of Russian election interference. There's some very credible reporting from the Bild newspaper in Germany and a couple other sources that came out shortly before the election showing not only how much money they were putting in, but itemized spending reports. And those reports showed kind of the playbook that they've used in the past. So a lot of the money was being spent on friendly opposition candidates, other friendly candidates. So what that implied, and they haven't linked specific parties, though I think anybody has a lot of guesses, other nominally, say, pro-European parties or pro-reform parties were actually part of this effort to build a type of unstable coalition or eventually coalition with Mr. Dodon and the socialists in order to weaken the PAS position by taking their natural constituencies away from them. And this is what's happened a lot in past elections in Moldova. With these unstable coalitions, a lot of times the groups don't trust each other, and sometimes for very good reason. And then reporting, finding out that this person who you think is on your team is actually on the other team and being paid a huge amount. And the big difference here is we don't have that unstable coalition. We have one party, won an absolutely overwhelming majority with 63 seats. And that means they can afford to lose a couple people. Hopefully, they are going to be very careful at policing their ranks and making sure that they have a firm and kind of loyal team in the key seats. But bigger than the majority, it really showed that this playbook of kind of divide on wedge issues and splinter the reform coalition didn't work in the election. And I'm not sure it's going to start working after. There were parties here running on every wedge issue. With the socialists, it was very anti-NATO, very the West is going to come and take over the country, very kind of traditional values, anti-gay marriage, these things. Then you had a fairly intense far right-wing Union with Romania party that proposed uniting with Romania. And you had a whole spectrum in between of what's called the left and the right in Moldova, of these parties that were intended to act as spoilers in some way. They would siphon some votes away. They'd create a weaker coalition, and the people just did not go for it. I mean, in absolutely massive margins, like these parties didn't come close. Some of them were polling at maybe 4%, close to the 5% threshold, and then would get like 1%. So I think that the hope here is in the mandate. The hope is in the, well, let's say the ability of the PAS party to act out that mandate, but also that we just don't have the things we've seen in a lot of these other countries and the problems we've had in Moldova in the past, where you just had so much instability with so many different groups. It's maybe not I don't know, maybe not something many people say, but quite true. This party is held together by President Maia Sandu. We have one real leader and moral leader of the party who is setting a direction and getting people to work. And I think that that does have a lot of hope. But we'll see. It is the difficult question, Yeah.
Well, I want to ask one last question to both of you. And it's really, what does the West do? Because let's say in the old days, when there were changes in the region, you'd often have this East versus West approach. You know, we have to shore up this country because Russia is trying to interfere. And it was a very, big geopolitical type of game. And now we have something different that I think both of you are describing. So that the question that I want to ask, and Bill will go to you, and then we'll have David come back and sum up. Bill, what should the West do in this case? Hands off, support how, if they should? How would you define what the West should do?
Well, I think we should help, and we should help quickly and in practical ways. I had the occasion not too long ago to ask President Sandu what she needed most, and she quickly replied, we need vaccines and medical equipment. And that's something that we can do. It's not political, but it answers needs. I've been impressed both by President Sandu and by the party, those in the party around her, the ability to show that they learn and to deal practically with the questions of governance that really make a difference to the people that voted for them. And that's where I think outsiders can help. So of course they need money, and they need to get it quick. I would point up the example of the United States with the last pro-European, overtly pro-European coalition that was voted in 2009. The US welcomed the new coalition, said we would support it, and it took us like 2.5 years to get Millennium Challenge Corporation funds out into Moldova. And by that time, events had gone off in directions that they had taken care of things. So it's important, I think, to act practically and quickly. The other thing that I believe that Moldova needs is people. 500,000 to 1 million Moldovans of working age, the most enterprising, the most talented, some of the best educated, have scattered to the four winds and are sending money home. One quick example: President Sandu says her priority are the courts and the procurators, where she's going to have, in Russian they use the term purge of widespread, but they're going to fire a lot of corrupt officials, and they need to replace them. And this is hundreds of people with some ability, some education, and some demonstrated record of being honest. And where are they going to get these? A lot of this is going to be searching out Moldovans abroad and getting them to come home, or in helping. Other countries have had this around the globe. Foreign countries provide experts that actually sit in the country and provide assistance in doing jobs or showing how they're done. This is something that has to be worked out. But there is going to have to be an infusion of personnel, because so many have left and so many need to be replaced in order to have things work differently. If this doesn't happen, eventually it could slide back to the same old way of doing things, which we know very well, and which is not terribly happy. So that is what I look at, not a political aspect of saying orientation with the EU, orientation with NATO, but rather putting these things in that allow Moldova to become more prosperous, more stable, and more secure. And I know this is a direction in which President Sandu and her party wish to go, is strengthening Moldova domestically, and in that sense, making it a better and more stable, more reliable partner for all of its neighbors and for East and West. And this, I think, is a way of avoiding an overtly geopolitical approach, but actually helping cement this change.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And David Smith, I'm going to leave it to you for the last word. And the same question: what should the West do, if anything, to support the change that's taking place in Moldova?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I want to agree completely with everything that was just said. I think to go through a couple quick thoughts to add on to it, Moldova has a very adequate supply of vaccines right now. Everybody can use more, but the demand is not there. We have real serious projections of a third wave coming with the Delta variant spreading. So I think one of the first big challenges that is not planned for by the government will be around health. And that's something where there can be support with vaccines, with expertise from both, the West, the EU. The biggest partner for Moldova during the COVID pandemic has been Romania around vaccines. But in any case, I do want to stress, I think that is going to be a huge initial challenge. And then secondly, when you're talking about money, the real question is where do you spend money? Moldova definitely needs financial support. And it looks like the donor countries are coming out rather quickly for that. Again, as opposed to in 2009 or past times where it's taken a long time to get a comprehensive program moving. What they really need is the money and flexibility on how to invest it and bring personnel into the government who are able to make the changes that they want to affect. So Moldova has a lot of very talented, very educated people. Many have gone and worked in the diaspora. Many have just worked and done careers here. But it is hard to attract people into government jobs. I was speaking to a friend of mine recently who's a lawyer, and he said, I'm a patriot, but I'm not going to close my legal practice and leave my business to go work for $400 a month. Like, I can't do that. I'm a patriot, but I have a family, right? And a lot of studies have shown that, like, if you are just raising salaries without the purging or firing corrupt officials, you're not helping anything. But if you're firing officials, you also need to be able to have a carrot to bring in new people. And for all these reasons, Moldova really does need financial support from its partners in the West in order to get in and start enacting reform. By almost any way you look at it, the Moldovan economy is not living up to its potential, and their tax revenues are not nearly associated with the amount of business that goes on here. A lot of business here is done off the books or with tax evasion or different shortcuts, and often very much with the acquiescence of the government, who inspectors prefer to take a bribe than make sure you pay their taxes. So these challenges are going to take time to sort out. Moldova should be able, in time, after reform, to build a much more sustainable government and economy. But in the short term, it needs to do things quickly. In order to do things quickly, they need support. And I'll end a quick thought on bringing in expertise from outside the country. There have been a lot of different development programs and missions from the US and others who have come in here with expertise. But I've found, this is my opinion, but the ones that have worked best have come in and essentially bridged that salary gap. They've hired really talented, competent people from the local market, gotten them engaged in the process of reform, and then used a combination of their work product and political will from USAID and other partners to come in and try to get that reform up. In this case, we'll have a government that's looking for the help for the reform. So keeping those programs running, bringing that expertise in, engaging local expertise, I think is going to be the most important thing to getting this all moving.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. And I think on so many levels, these were the perfect experts, because we had the geopolitical importance of this explained by Bill Hill and David Smith giving kind of on the ground. And I have to go back, Bill mentioned this early on, the influence of COVID around the world is creating a lot of political change. And I think you gentlemen really explain why that is. That it's not just the idea of, democracy or big ideas. It's really, how do people live in their everyday lives, and the importance of a government to protect them from challenges and diseases. And I learned a lot during this discussion. I want to thank you very much, William Hill, Global Fellow at the Kennan Institute here at the Wilson Center, and also David Smith there in Moldova. Thank you very much. He is the president of the Moldova Small Enterprise Alliance. And thank you to our viewers. I hope you'll stay tuned for more of these discussions, and have a good day.